Cara Bennett lived a life marked more by restraint than indulgence. At 34, she had become an unnoticed fixture in the Spokane office where she processed insurance claims. Most people didn't remember how long she had been there, only that she was reliable, quiet, kind. She brought in muffins on Fridays, not the store-bought kind, but ones she actually baked, always labeling them with hand-drawn smiley faces. Her cubicle had a tiny cactus named Midge, a framed photo of her late mother beside a postcard of Glacier National Park, and a pinned quote that read, "Do small things with great love." No one knew she had typed and printed that quote herself after a particularly heavy winter when her loneliness became louder than the wind against her windows. It was the small things that kept her steady: her daily walk to the bus stop, her thermos of lentil soup, her Sunday calls to her aunt in Idaho who often forgot she was calling from Washington, not Wisconsin. Her brother's wedding in San Diego was supposed to be one of the bright spots. She had marked the date on her calendar in soft blue ink and planned each detail with care, budgeting enough for the hotel but not for extras like sightseeing or souvenirs. When she booked her economy seat, she did so with quiet acceptance. Flying was a luxury, being there for her brother was the point. She never expected anything more. The week before the flight, a card appeared on her desk during lunch hour. Inside was a business-class boarding pass and a note scribbled in her coworker Monica's familiar handwriting, "From all of us. Because you've never once asked for anything, and we think you deserve a moment of ease." There was no signature list, no announcement. Just the envelope, discreet and sincere. It nearly made her cry. She tucked it carefully into her wallet like a secret. On the morning of the flight, she arrived early. Airports unsettled her, not the flying, but the crowds, the noise, the sense that everyone had somewhere exciting to be. She sipped tea from a paper cup, clutching her shoulder bag like a shield. The sun filtered through the wide windows of the terminal, casting long strips of light across the gate area. That's when she noticed him. He sat alone near the far row of chairs, hunched slightly as if trying to disappear. His skin told stories he hadn't. Scars twisted across his face and neck like rivers over scorched earth. His hands, stiff and rigid, looked like they had fought through fire. Some people stared, but quickly looked away when he noticed. Others shifted seats. Even the gate agent, when confirming boarding groups, avoided eye contact. He didn't seem surprised by any of it. He reached into his bag, a faded brown canvas case with an old army patch sewn near the zipper, and accidentally tipped it over. Small items tumbled out: a toothbrush, a tiny notebook, a travel-sized shampoo, a picture that he quickly tucked back in. No one moved to help. Cara rose without thinking. She knelt beside him, helping to gather the items gently, pretending not to notice the tremble in his fingers or the way he flinched when her hand brushed his. Their eyes met for a moment, and she saw more than pain. She saw someone used to being seen last. His boarding pass had landed between them. She noticed the seat number, 42B, a middle seat, back of the plane. She thought of the plush business-class chair waiting for her. The hot towel they'd offer. The full meal served with metal cutlery. The space to breathe. She also thought of her uncle, who returned from Iraq missing part of his leg and most of his hope, and who once said that the hardest part wasn't what he lost, but how strangers made him feel invisible. Cara slipped her own boarding pass into his hand without a word. She folded his and tucked it into her jacket. He looked at her, startled, but she smiled with such calm sincerity that he didn't protest. He opened his mouth as if to speak but then nodded instead, eyes misting briefly before he looked away. She boarded with the last group, carrying her wrinkled tote and the silence of her decision. Her assigned seat was flanked by a teenager immersed in a noisy mobile game and an older woman whose head rested heavily on Cara's shoulder minutes after takeoff. The seat barely reclined. Her knees touched the seat in front of her. The tray table creaked when she lowered it. The coffee was burnt, and the sandwich tasted like cardboard. Through the curtain separating coach from business class, she could sometimes glimpse him. The man with fire on his skin, now reclining in quiet dignity, speaking softly with the attendant. His eyes no longer scanning for judgment. For once, people weren't looking through him. They were looking at him. She shifted slightly to relieve her numb leg and sipped warm water from a tiny plastic cup. She closed her eyes and imagined her uncle smiling, not the forced kind he wore in family photos, but the one he had when she brought him fresh socks in the hospital. She felt something tighten in her throat but didn't let it rise. It wasn't about generosity or sacrifice. It wasn't even about fairness. It was about seeing someone. And making space. Even if that space had once been meant for you. 3 weeks passed. The flight felt like a faded photograph in Kara's memory, something shelved quietly among the file drawers of daily life. She returned to her cubicle and her cactus. She resumed her bus rides and careful budgeting. She tucked the economy receipt from the return flight into her records folder, next to the ones from old oil changes and discounted winter coats. No one in the office asked about the trip beyond the polite "how was it?" They didn't need to. She simply said, "It was good to see my brother happy." That was enough. She didn't mention the man, or the seat, or the quiet warmth that still lingered from the decision. Some things weren't meant for stories, they were meant for stillness. Then came the morning that shattered the stillness entirely. It was a Thursday, barely past 6. Kara stood at the sink brushing her teeth when the walls began to shake. At first she thought it was a low-flying plane, but the sound deepened and pulsed like something alive. The mirror trembled. A coffee cup rattled off the edge of her table and shattered on the tile. She rushed to the window. Outside, the world tilted sideways. A helicopter, massive and dark green with military markings, hovered just above the school field behind her small townhouse complex. Its blades churned the air into chaos, flattening grass and sending debris skittering across the asphalt. She backed away instinctively, heart thudding. Then came the knock at the door. 3 sharp raps. She opened it to find 2 uniformed men, clean-shaven and stone-faced, standing on her porch. Behind them, her street bloomed with activity, black SUVs, more personnel, neighbors stepping outside in confusion, clutching coffee mugs and bathrobes. No sirens. Just the soft hum of deliberate movement. One of the men addressed her by name. Then he said the words she would remember for the rest of her life. "You're being requested for a meeting." Requested. Not summoned. Not interrogated. Requested. Her breath caught in her throat. They didn't cuff her or question her. Instead, they escorted her to one of the vehicles with quiet formality. One offered her a blanket. Another handed her a sealed envelope. She clutched it without opening it, too stunned to speak. Inside the vehicle, they drove in silence for several minutes before arriving at the school field. The helicopter's door hung open like an invitation. Inside, she sat alone with her thoughts while the craft lifted into the sky. Through the thick windows, her town shrank into a toy set. Roofs. Streets. The curve of her bus stop. All growing smaller. The helicopter didn't fly for long. It landed at a nearby military base, one she'd never known existed. The gates opened without hesitation. Inside, officers stood at attention. She was guided not into a hangar or meeting room but into a small, immaculate hall with a row of portraits on the wall. Distinguished faces. Rows of ribbons. A hushed reverence filled the space, like a chapel without pews. Then, from the far side of the room, he walked in. The man from the plane. Only now, he wore his scars differently, not hidden, but held with the upright grace of someone who had nothing left to prove. His uniform bore the insignia of a Marine Corps major. His chest carried honors she couldn't name, but one caught her eye, a blue ribbon holding a medal shaped like a starburst, unlike anything she had seen before. He stood before her in silence for a moment, then offered a slight nod. Someone handed her a folder, which she opened with trembling hands. Inside was a brief file. Major Jason Hull. Former field officer. Recipient of the Navy Cross and the Medal of Valor. Injured in a covert rescue operation overseas in 2017. Carried 2 wounded soldiers out of a collapsing compound under enemy fire. Over 70% of his body burned. Left active duty. refused public interviews, declined invitations to speak or be honored. Until now. The folder included a transcript, his speech at a recent closed-door award ceremony at the Pentagon. In it, he recounted the mission, the fire, the years of pain. And then, in his closing paragraph, he said her name. Not as a hero, but as a reminder. He described how, in all the years he'd endured pity, avoidance, and performative applause, no one had treated him with quiet humanity. No one until the woman at Gate 37B, who picked up his things as if it were the most normal thing in the world. Who gave him her seat without explanation. Who didn't flinch. She had reminded him that being seen wasn't the same as being pitied. She had reminded him what dignity felt like. She had reminded him he was still a man. Kara set the file down, unsure of whether to cry or simply sit still forever. The next hour passed in a haze. She was told that the story had reached high command. That it had been shared at leadership briefings. That someone, somewhere, had said the words, "This is the America we defend." And because of that, an exception had been made. It was rare, they said. Not a policy. Not something done lightly. But this time, it was deserved. They offered her a choice. A recognition ceremony in Washington. Or something else. Not medals or cameras. But an experience most civilians would never receive. She chose the second. By nightfall, she was on another military aircraft, heading not home, but toward a mountain lodge deep in the Colorado Rockies. A place used for strategic retreats and private gatherings. A place where decisions were made and secrets kept. But to Kara, it felt like something else. A clearing of silence. A thank you written in landscape. She pressed her face to the window as the lights of the base faded below, replaced by stars. She hadn't expected gratitude. And yet, here it was. Not loud. Just true. The air in Colorado was different. Not just thinner, though the elevation pressed lightly against her lungs, but quieter in a way that felt ancient. As if the mountains had agreed to keep her secrets, and the pines whispered only to those who had earned their silence. The military lodge she was brought to stood at the edge of a wide cliff, its wooden beams worn smooth by wind and time. It had no sign. No welcome mat. Only a security checkpoint manned by respectful eyes and steady hands. Kara arrived at night, and even then the stars seemed to open wider for her. She was shown to a suite with thick curtains and thick walls. The kind of quiet you couldn't buy in a city. No television. Just a fireplace and a small envelope resting on the desk, bearing her name in elegant script. Inside, a single line. You remind us who we're serving. J.H. She set it down gently and didn't pick it up again. Instead, she stood at the window, watching as distant floodlights blinked on and off, dotting the far ridgelines like signals from another world. In the days that followed, she was given a glimpse into a life few civilians were ever invited to witness. Mornings began with escorted hikes along secured trails where weathered signs marked boundaries between operational zones and ancient forests. Each path was maintained with the precision of a battlefield, and yet the natural beauty was untouched, respected, not tamed. She ate at the officers' hall, where long tables hosted conversations in soft tones about missions, recovery, and resilience. No one asked what she did for a living. No one questioned why she was there. Her presence had already been earned in a currency greater than credentials. On the third day, she was invited to observe a simulation. It wasn't like the war movies. No shouting. No blaring horns or CGI explosions. Just focused movements, calm orders, and a kind of choreography built from muscle memory and trust. She stood behind a glass wall, watching teams navigate a mock hostage situation in an urban replica. One of the instructors leaned over and explained the maneuvers with gentle clarity, as if he were guiding a guest through a museum instead of a training ground. At one point, she noticed a young recruit pause briefly in the middle of a corridor and glance upward, toward the observation window. He nodded at her before returning to his task. That nod stayed with her longer than the entire exercise. Evenings were softer. She was offered time in the archives, a quiet space lined with binders, letters, photos. Pages worn by fingers that once trembled with grief or pride. In one file, she found a letter written by a mother to her son, stationed overseas. It ended with the words, "Remember, you are seen." She thought of the man on the plane. She thought of all the people she'd passed over the years, on buses, in waiting rooms, on park benches, whose pain had become invisible simply because it made others uncomfortable. On her final night, a private dinner was arranged at the edge of the property, beneath a stretch of stars that looked close enough to touch. A single table, 2 chairs. No decorations. Just a lantern flickering gently and the scent of pine in the wind. Major Hull arrived in dress uniform. His scars were visible in the low light, unhidden. He carried a small wooden box under one arm and placed it on the table without a word. They ate in near silence. The food was hearty: potatoes, trout, buttered greens. Simple, but perfectly made. Kara found herself eating slowly, tasting each bite as if it were a message. After they finished, he opened the box. Inside were 2 airline tickets. First class, international. She recognized the destination immediately: Sydney, Australia. His name was on one. Hers on the other. He explained, in the same quiet tone he had used that day at the gate, that he would be returning to Australia for extended medical treatment. But not as a patient lost in a system, this time as an advisor helping develop new veteran support programs. The work would be long. Lonely, maybe. But purposeful. He said he'd reserved the second ticket before he even left Washington. Not because he expected her to use it, but because he wanted her to know that her gesture had made the journey possible. She didn't accept the ticket. Not that night. She didn't decline it either. She simply let her hand rest over the envelope as they watched the stars burn gently above them. Later, when she returned to her suite, she placed the ticket inside her bag. Not as a promise, but as a reminder. The next morning, a helicopter flew her back to Spokane. As she stepped into her home, it struck her how small and still everything felt. The cactus on the sill. The quiet hum of the fridge. The unopened stack of mail. She didn't unpack right away. Instead, she sat on the edge of her bed and allowed herself to feel the weight of the past few days. Not the grandeur of it, but the meaning. The strange unfolding of a life changed by one unremarkable act. Not a speech. Not a rescue. Not a miracle. Just a seat. Just a choice. And the ripple it caused in hearts built like mountains. Autumn settled over Spokane in quiet strokes, burnt leaves drifting like slow thoughts down empty sidewalks, the morning bus now colder beneath her fingertips. Kara returned to her life with the same steps she had always taken, but something beneath them had changed. The rhythm wasn't louder, just deeper. Her office looked exactly as she had left it. The cactus still leaned toward the window as if searching for something beyond glass. Her coworkers welcomed her back with warm smiles and the usual questions. How was your time off? Did you see the city? Take any pictures? She answered politely, vaguely, not out of secrecy, but out of reverence. Some stories didn't belong to water-cooler conversations. Some belonged to memory alone. A week after her return, she found the package. It had no return address, only her name printed in firm, narrow letters. Inside was a carefully packed model of a military helicopter, an exact replica of the one that had landed behind her townhouse. Its details were precise: the tail number, the paint worn at the corners, the faint imprint of an American flag. Beneath the model was a folded note. The handwriting was unfamiliar but careful. Measured. Each word written with deliberate care. It thanked her, not for giving up a seat, but for something else entirely. For refusing to flinch. For seeing the man beneath the scars. For standing in a moment where no one else had. It said that sometimes dignity is a heavier gift than comfort, and that her decision had restored something that injury and war had nearly erased. The last line read, "Scars do not measure worth. Recognition does. You offered it freely. I carry that further than any medal." She placed the model on her desk, next to the cactus and the quote she had long since stopped noticing. She didn't tell anyone what it meant. But each time someone asked, she would smile gently and say it reminded her of a flight she once took. Nothing more. Time passed, but the changes it left behind did not fade. Her coworkers began to treat her with a subtler form of respect. Not the loud kind, no handshakes or tributes, but the sort that appeared in how they asked for her opinion more often, how they paused when she spoke. Something about her had shifted, and though no one named it, they all seemed to feel it. It wasn't long before small changes began spreading in the office. An older claims analyst began taking afternoon walks with the new intern who stuttered when nervous. A receptionist who rarely spoke started leaving coffee at the desk of the janitor before his early shift. There was no memo, no initiative, just a quiet culture of attentiveness blooming from somewhere unspoken. Kara noticed, but never claimed credit. She simply kept doing what she always had, baking muffins on Fridays, remembering birthdays, returning shopping carts others had left loose in the lot. But now, those acts didn't feel like habits. They felt like choices. One evening, while reviewing a storm damage report from a client she'd never met, she found herself pausing mid-sentence. The paper in front of her blurred. Not from tears, but from something heavier, the realization that a moment so small, one unnoticed step toward a man at an airport gate, had echoed outward in ways she would never fully see. In the quiet of her home that night, she took out the ticket to Australia. She hadn't decided yet. It remained in her drawer, next to a photo of her brother's wedding and the folded envelope that had once held her business class seat. It wasn't about whether she would use it. It was about what it meant, that sometimes, the universe handed back the weight you had given, not in the same form, but multiplied through the lives it touched. She often thought of the moment on the plane. The silence between them. The way the man, Major Hull, had looked not at her, but into her. As if trying to memorize something he hadn't felt in years, the comfort of being human, unjudged, unexamined. One afternoon in early winter, a boy came into the office building. He was around 12, small for his age, with a tattered backpack and a flyer about veterans programs. He had gotten off at the wrong stop. One of the secretaries waved him toward the door without much interest. Kara stood and crossed the lobby. She knelt beside him, offered him a cup of water, and asked where he was trying to go. He pointed at a local VA center printed on the paper. She called a rideshare herself, paid the fare in advance, and waited with him until it arrived. As the boy climbed into the car, he turned to her and said, "Thanks for not being like the others." She nodded, her heart catching for a moment. She returned to her desk and looked at the helicopter model. It gleamed softly in the afternoon light, silent and watchful. In a world that sometimes moved too fast to notice, she had chosen to notice. And that was enough. Not everyone would understand what she had done. Not everyone needed to. Because kindness, when offered without question, had a way of changing everything, even if it took time to be seen. And she had learned this. Kindness, offered freely, without witness or reward, was not a weakness. It was a quiet form of power. It was enough.